What if the stability you cling to is just the stillness that pulled you away from who you are? On the edge of a village bordered by neat fences and perfectly trimmed gardens lived a woman who rarely spoke. No one remembered her name. They simply called her the one who stopped growing. Her eyes were deep, like someone who had seen too much. Her hands were calm, like someone who had stopped asking. She wore neutral fabrics, spoke softly, was always polite. But no one noticed her feet never truly touched the ground. She walked as if floating out of obligation. They said she had once been a restless child, climbed trees, spoke to animals, drew with mud. But one night, without warning, they cut down the fig tree she loved. And something inside her was severed too. After that, she began wearing closed shoes, crossed her legs when she sat, apologized when she laughed too loud. Everyone admired her. She was composed, sensible, reliable, but no one saw the emptiness where once there had been pulse. She herself no longer remembered the sound of her laughter. She lived like a decorative plant, lovely, restrained, and always in place. Until one day, during a purposeless walk, she saw a root exposed in the earth, thick, firm, alive. She stopped, unsure why, but something in her chest trembled. Without thinking, she knelt, removed her shoes, and pressed her bare feet to that ancient root. In that moment, she felt a jolt, as if something dormant had stirred in her body. And the ground, for the first time in years, called her by the name she had forgotten. That night, her feet tingled, not from pain, but from remembering. Something inside her stirred, as if her skin knew something her mind had long silenced. She lay down early, but couldn't sleep. The earth seemed to be calling. And the sound of the root, which she swore she'd heard, echoed in her chest like a buried drum. For the first time in many years, she dreamed of the fig tree. But in the dream, it hadn't been cut. It was alive, vast, its branches touching the sky, its roots woven through everything. The girl, who had once been her, ran barefoot around it, feet muddy, hair wild in the wind. She said nothing, but her entire body laughed. When she awoke, the ground felt more alive, the house walls smaller. She flung the windows open, inhaled the morning air like it carried an unspoken truth. With trembling hands, she searched her closet and found an old floral dress she hadn't worn in years. She put it on slowly, like someone remembering a forgotten name. She stepped outside with no destination, but her feet knew. And soon she found herself again before the exposed root. This time, someone had placed small stones around it, a quiet circle. She sat inside it, pressed her palm against the root, closed her eyes, and there it was. Her whole life had been organized around an absence. Everything she'd called balance was just control. Everything she called maturity was fear. But now, with her feet in the earth and her body surrendered to not knowing, something began to grow again. Not upward, but inward. In the days that followed, something shifted. She still walked the same streets, greeted the same people, brewed the same tea with care. But inside, everything was different. Her voice no longer obeyed so quickly. Her body, once tamed, now longed to move, not in rebellion, but in remembrance. She began walking barefoot in her backyard, first in secret, then without guilt. The damp earth seemed to speak to the soles of her feet. She also began humming softly, songs without lyrics, sounds from nowhere. One day, catching her reflection, she saw something new in her eyes. Not happiness, presence. Her closet started to feel strange. The clothes, heavy. Her gestures, rehearsed. One afternoon, dressed for a village meeting, she looked in the mirror and didn't recognize herself. She undressed and stood there, wearing a light tunic, barefoot, hair untamed, unsure if it was a beginning or simply a memory. People noticed, said she seemed different. Some praised, others looked uneasy. But she didn't explain. She was learning, slowly, that certain changes don't need defending, only continuing. One night, she heard a noise outside. She stepped into the yard with a lantern and saw a fox. It didn't run, just looked at her as if recognizing one of its own. And in that gaze, something was affirmed. A part of her had never been tamed. She went back inside with tears in her eyes, and for the first time understood what she'd called loneliness was simply longing for herself. The next morning, she removed the rugs from her house. She wanted the bare ground. She wanted to feel the texture under her feet with nothing in between. Then, she opened the cabinets and began sorting through clothes, objects, frames, notebooks filled with old goals. It wasn't decluttering. It was mourning. A quiet burial of all the versions she had worn that were never hers. Each discarded item seemed to return a breath she hadn't realized was missing. Every paper burned in the yard released a gesture she had never dared to make. She didn't cry, but she smiled with a gentle melancholy, like saying goodbye to something she once believed was home, but had only ever been a display case. A neighbor, seeing her barefoot, asked if everything was all right. She simply smiled and replied, "I'm on my way home." The woman didn't understand, but the fox, in the distance, ran by. Like a reminder, at dusk she returned to the root. This time she brought dried flowers and a handful of seeds. She made a small circle, whispered words not from her mind, and sat, feet in the soil, eyes closed. There she asked for nothing, gave thanks for nothing. She simply breathed, and in that intentionless silence something began to sprout. Not outside, inside. It was as if the wild essence, long locked away somewhere in her chest, had begun to stir. A new rhythm, an ancient drum, a wind that answered to no schedule, no task. Oh, she wasn't seeking meaning anymore, because she had become the path itself. One day when she returned to the root, she found marks on the ground, small footprints, scattered petals, a red thread caught on a branch. She wasn't startled. She simply sat, as always, feet on the earth. She knew, without needing to know, that others had heard the call. From that point on, she noticed different gazes in the village. Children ran barefoot when they saw her. Women loosened their hair as they passed. Men, quietly, averted their eyes, not in shame, but in recognition. It wasn't rebellion. It was memory. Soon, someone left a stone by the root. Another, a seashell. An elder brought a cake and placed it on a cloth, without saying a word, and she received it all without speech, because she knew what connected her to that root wasn't possession, but bond. A bond older than names, older than roles, older than the structures they were taught to inhabit. The wild essence, once thought to be hers alone, now revealed itself as a shared field, something that lived in everyone, but lay dormant. And the most curious thing? No one talked about it. There were no gatherings, no invitations, only gestures. Presences arriving and leaving behind traces as soft as someone asking the ground for permission. She understood then. Her return to the root wasn't a personal act. It was an ancestral rite that only needed a body willing to remember, and that body now was hers. That night, as she sat before the mirror, she saw in her own eyes something unfamiliar. Not youth, not joy, but origin. As if the woman now living in that body had always been awaited, even if no one knew by whom. She wasn't seeking reference anymore, didn't wish to resemble anything. She simply allowed herself to be, not to prove strength, but to hold the fullness of what was returning. She walked the streets like someone dancing with no music. Her body, once restrained, now had its own language. A step, a turn, a long pause to observe a fallen leaf. Nothing was useful. Everything was essential. One day, a child followed her in silence. They walked together to the root. The girl asked nothing, just sat beside her, took off her shoes and smiled. And in that toothless smile, she saw herself before the cut. She took the child's hand and without speaking guided her to the trunk. Together they pressed their palms to the wood. And then she knew the root once severed didn't need recovering. For somewhere deep within, It had grown again, not in visible branches, but in unseen veins that now touched the world from the inside. And there, with the child beside her and wind on her face, she knew. The wild essence isn't a state of mind. It's a wall-less home inside the body. And she, finally, was home. The next morning she didn't go to the root. Not out of forgetfulness, but fullness. She was in her yard, hands covered in soil, planting herbs without names. She hummed softly, tunelessly, like someone stitching time with sound. The fox watched from afar, not as a guest but as a witness. The floral dress danced with the wind. Her feet, marked by the ground, left traces that didn't need to be followed. Because now, those who found her wouldn't see just a woman. They'd see a field, a space where instinct is welcome and silence honored. In the village, some said she had changed too much. Others that she had finally returned to who she truly was. But she no longer clung to interpretation. She knew she had crossed a threshold with no return, and that, at last, was freedom. At sunset, she left a handwritten note at her door. If you too were pulled away from yourself, come barefoot. The earth still knows your name. She didn't sign it, didn't wait. She simply lit a candle and placed it by the window, as if to say, I'm here, but I'm no longer the one who waits. And that night, before sleep, she whispered inward, my root grew back where no one else could see. If something in you also pulses where no hand reaches, sit with us. The trail is still alive beneath the silence.